After my husband's funeral, I still wore the black dress that smelled faintly of lilies from the church, the hem brushing against my ankles as I carried my 2-year-old daughter on my hip. My heart was still raw an open wound that refused to scab over, and yet I forced myself to walk into my sister's house for her son's first birthday party. The air was filled with the smell of frosted cupcakes, and helium balloons bounced against the ceiling while relatives clapped and laughed, the sound piercing through the silence that had wrapped around me for weeks. I stood at the doorway for a moment, clutching my daughter tightly, feeling like I was intruding on a world that had moved on without me. My chest ached with the dissonance of grief colliding with celebration, the cruel timing of life that allowed death and birth to sit side by side. As I tried to settle into the corner, forcing a smile when neighbors patted my back, my sister picked up her son, perched him proudly on her hip, and raised her glass. The chatter died down. Every pair of eyes turned toward her, and mine followed heavy with confusion. She cleared her throat, and with a smirk that still chills me, she declared that her son was not just her child, but also the son of my late husband. Her words slammed into me like a brick to the chest. The room erupted in shocked gasps, whispers ricocheted around the walls, and I froze as if nailed to the floor. My grip on my daughter's small hand tightened until she whimpered, and I forced myself to loosen it, though my blood had already gone cold. Then my sister laid out a piece of paper on the cake table, a photocopied will with my husband's name scrawled in shaky ink, and she announced with triumph that half of my $800,000 house now belonged to her son. I heard someone whisper behind me, "Poor girl, she's about to lose everything," and another cousin murmured, "Well, at least the boy will keep the family name alive." My stomach twisted with humiliation, anger, and disbelief. I wanted to scream, to tear that forged paper in half, but my body betrayed me, and I stayed still, every eye burning holes into my skin. Then came the voice that cut deeper than any blade my mother's. She leaned back in her chair, looked at me with disdain, and said, "See, this is what we always told you. You couldn't even give him a son." The words echoed in my skull louder than the children's laughter, louder than the clinking glasses, louder than my own heartbeat. I felt stripped bare, as if the little dignity I had left after burying my husband was being peeled away, layer by layer, in front of the entire family. My sister basked in the attention, smiling as if she had just won a battle, while my parents nodded approvingly, proud of the grandson who now symbolized everything they valued. My daughter tugged at my sleeve, confused, her wide eyes silently asking why everyone was looking at us that way, why her grandmother seemed to celebrate another child while dismissing her existence. My lips trembled, but no words came out. All I managed was a faint smile, brittle and sharp, a smile that covered the storm raging inside me. Because what no one in that room knew, not even my sister with her smug announcement, was that I already had proof, and that proof would tear apart every lie she had just planted in that poisoned soil of whispers and humiliation. I said nothing, not then, not with their eyes searing into me and their judgment pressing me down, because silence would be my sharpest weapon. The truth was waiting sharp and undeniable, and when the time came, it would cut deeper than their cruelty ever could. My name is Emily Carter. I am 29 years old, and I never imagined that widowhood would come crashing into my life before I had even crossed the threshold of 30. Before the funeral, before the humiliating birthday party, my world had been a simple one. I worked as a project coordinator at a local firm, balancing schedules and spreadsheets, drinking too much coffee in the mornings, and kissing my husband Michael before he left for his engineering job. We had bought a modest but beautiful home in the suburbs, a 2-story place with white shutters and a yard where our little girl could someday play tag. That house cost $800,000, every cent scraped together from years of savings, long nights of overtime, and careful planning. To us, it wasn't just a house, it was proof that we had built a life worth living. Michael and I had always been partners, not just in marriage, but in survival. He held my hand during the birth of our daughter Grace, and whispered promises of forever, even as exhaustion lined his eyes. He was the kind of man who carried groceries in one arm and our daughter in the other, who fixed broken sinks after 12-hour shifts, who scribbled "I love you" notes on sticky pads and hid them in my purse. Losing him so suddenly in a car accident felt like having the air ripped out of my lungs, and I walked around for weeks like a ghost clutching Grace as if she were my only tether to the earth. But to understand why my sister's announcement burned so deep, you have to understand the roots that twisted our family tree long before Michael ever came into my life. I grew up in a house where gender was not just an identity, but a currency. My parents, steeped in old traditions, measured worth in sons in the continuation of the family name, in the hope of grandsons who would carry it all forward. From the moment I was born, I was a disappointment. Another girl my father sighed according to the story my aunt once told me. My older sister Melissa was already 3 years old, and she had been crowned the golden child. Not because she was extraordinary in school or kind at heart, but because my parents looked at her and imagined future sons. They pinned their legacy on her like a badge of honor, whispering that she would give them grandsons' heirs, someone to carry the Carter name. I, on the other hand, was the second daughter, the unnecessary one. No one said it outright, not in the early years, but it was in the way my father clapped Melissa on the back when she managed a passing grade while looking at my straight A's as though they were the bare minimum. It was in the way my mother brushed Melissa's hair and told her she was born to be a mother while reminding me that brains don't keep a family name alive. At family gatherings, relatives pinched Melissa's cheeks and predicted she would give them strong boys while I stood in the corner listening, swallowing the bitterness that came with being invisible. Melissa learned early how to weaponize that favoritism. She would smirk when I cried after another dismissal from my parents, telling me, "Don't take it so seriously, Emily. It's just the way it is. You're too sensitive." She gaslighted me even as a child, turning every cut into a joke, making me question my own feelings. And every time my parents caught me confronting her, they turned on me saying, "Why do you always fight with your sister?" She didn't mean anything by it. Slowly, I learned silence. I learned to fold my emotions into tiny boxes and shove them into the corners of my heart. When Michael came into my life, he was the first person who made me feel like those boxes could be opened. He listened when I spoke, he valued my ideas, and when we had Grace, he called her our miracle with such joy that I almost forgot the sting of my parents' sigh when they realized she was a girl. My mother pursed her lips and said, "She's sweet, but not an heir." My father barely looked at her, distracted by Melissa's pregnancy. When Melissa later gave birth to a boy, the celebration in our family was louder than any holiday I can remember. They bought him toys, showered him with gold bracelets, called him our pride and joy. Meanwhile, Grace received a single pink blanket and a polite smile. I swallowed my hurt, clutching my daughter, whispering promises that she was enough, that she was everything. The divide grew sharper with time. Melissa became the darling of the family, her son the chosen heir. Every time she walked into a room, she carried an air of entitlement that only favoritism can feed. I became the shadow, the woman with a daughter, the widow who was now vulnerable. In their eyes, my house was not mine to keep, but a prize to be seized, especially since Melissa's son was a boy. In their twisted logic, everything that was mine could and perhaps should belong to him. And that was the soil in which the humiliation at the birthday party grew, nourished by decades of bias, watered by years of gaslighting until it bloomed into a poisonous declaration that left me shaking in front of everyone I thought was family. When I look back on my childhood with Melissa, I realize the seeds of betrayal were planted long before my husband ever entered the picture, long before the forged will and the cruel announcement at her son's birthday. They were sown in the smallest moments, watered by favoritism and nurtured by a system that valued her existence above mine. It began with school as simple as report cards spread out on the kitchen table. I would beam as I handed my parents a report card covered in straight A's, the fruit of sleepless nights and meticulous notes, only to hear my father grumble, "That's what we expect from you." Then Melissa, 2 years older and barely scraping by with C's and B's, would hand hers over. My mother would clap her hands and exclaim, "That's wonderful, Melissa, you're trying so hard." My father would ruffle her hair, pride in his eyes, while mine clouded over with disappointment because I had not been extraordinary enough. The second betrayal came with the most personal of joys: pregnancy. When I found out I was pregnant with Grace, I was over the moon. Michael and I cried tears of joy in the doctor's office, clinging to each other as we stared at the sonogram. But when I told my parents, their faces fell. Another girl my mother asked when the gender was revealed, her voice heavy with disappointment. Well, at least she'll be cute, my father muttered, shrugging. I felt the sting of their words burn hotter than any physical wound. And yet, when Melissa announced her pregnancy a year later, the family exploded with celebration. She was their golden hope, their chance for a grandson, the heir they had always dreamed of. When her baby boy was born, they practically built a shrine around his crib. My daughter was left in the shadows, her laughter overlooked, her milestones ignored. The third betrayal was quieter, but it dug deeper. Melissa liked to joke, to drop poisonous words wrapped in laughter. One afternoon, while helping me fold laundry, she smirked and said, "If I ever needed money, I'm sure Michael would help me. He's always been so kind to me." She said it casually, like tossing a pebble into a pond, watching the ripples disturb the surface. I froze the shirt in my hand, slipping onto the floor, but she just laughed, shaking her head. "Relax, Emily, you're so serious. I was only joking." But the smirk lingered, and the seed of doubt burrowed into my chest. When I confided in my parents about how uncomfortable her words made me, they rolled their eyes. Melissa was teasing. "Why do you always assume the worst?" Gaslighting became their weapon, making me feel like the villain for reacting to cruelty. Over time, these betrayals layered on top of each other like bricks in a wall, separating me from my family. I learned to expect humiliation, to anticipate being dismissed. Family dinners became trials where I was measured against Melissa's imagined greatness. If I shared an accomplishment, it was brushed aside. If she shared a minor success, it was met with applause. If I expressed hurt, I was told I was dramatic. If she hurt me, I was told I misunderstood. The imbalance was relentless, and yet I clung to Michael, to Grace, to the belief that I could build a family of my own, where love was not conditional, where my worth was not tied to the ability to produce a son. But Melissa's envy never rested. Even with a husband who adored me, even with a house we had built through sweat and sacrifice, she found ways to remind me of my supposed inferiority. At barbecues, she would casually mention how her son would inherit the Carter name, how he would carry the family line. "That's something Grace will never do," she once said, sipping her drink, smiling at me as though she had simply stated a fact. My parents laughed, nodding, and I felt my throat close as I bit down on the words that burned to escape. Every act, every joke, every dismissal built a pattern, a tapestry of betrayal that stretched across decades. By the time Michael died, I was already raw from years of being the lesser daughter, the lesser woman, the mother of a girl in a family that worshipped boys. And Melissa knew it. She knew exactly where my scars lay, and she pressed on them with precision at her son's birthday party. That announcement that forged Will, it wasn't born in a moment of desperation. It was the climax of a lifetime of envy and favoritism, the culmination of every time she had been rewarded for less, while I had been punished for more. Standing there in this corner of her decorated living room, clutching Grace, listening to her declare that her son was my husband's child and therefore entitled to half my house, I realized something profound. Melissa had been rehearsing this betrayal all her life. She had practiced it in the smirk when I cried, in the laughter when I protested, in the shrug of my parents' shoulders when I begged them to see me. This wasn't new. This was the final act of a play that had been running for years, and for the first time I felt the curtain begin to fall. Not on me, but on her. Because while she thought she had trapped me, she didn't know I had proof. And proof doesn't crumble under favoritism or gaslighting. Proof stands like stone. The birthday party should have been a harmless family gathering, a day of balloons, cake, and laughter for a 1-year-old child who would never remember it. But for me, it became the stage of my deepest humiliation. Melissa had strung pastel decorations across the walls of her living room, blue and gold streamers twisting down from the ceiling, a giant one banner hanging above the table where the cake sat waiting to be cut. Relatives milled about, balancing paper plates and plastic cups, snapping pictures on their phones, their chatter filling the air like a swarm of bees. Grace clung to my leg wide-eyed at the noise, while I tried to blend into the wallpaper, aching with the grief of burying Michael just days earlier. The laughter grated against my ears, each cheer for Melissa's baby boy, feeling like a reminder that life went on for everyone else while mine had collapsed into ashes. When it came time for speeches, Melissa stood at the center of the room, her baby perched proudly on her hip, her eyes gleaming with something sharper than maternal pride. She raised her glass, and the room fell into an expectant hush. I thought she would thank the guests, say something sweet about milestones, maybe crack a joke about sleepless nights. But instead, her lips curved into a smirk I had seen 100 times before, the smirk of a sister who had always known she was the chosen one. Her voice rang clear, slicing through the silence as she said, "I think it's time everyone knew the truth. This little boy isn't just my son. He is also Michael's." The words detonated in the air. Gasps echoed against the walls. A fork clattered to the floor. My aunt pressed her hand against her mouth, her eyes wide with scandalized glee. I froze my arms, tightening instinctively around Grace, who whimpered at the sudden tension. My ears buzzed, my body numb as whispers rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Did she just say, "Michael"? But he was married to Emily. Oh my God, poor Emily. The weight of 100 eyes crashed onto me, each gaze a blade cutting into my skin. And then Melissa reached for a folded paper on the table, spreading it flat against the cake stand. Michael knew this, she announced, her voice dripping with false righteousness. "Here is his will." He wanted half of the house to go to his son. The room surged forward, relatives craning their necks to see the photocopied document, its ink smudged, its signature barely legible. To anyone desperate to believe, it looked convincing enough. I could feel the tide of judgment turning against me, as though in a single moment I had gone from grieving widow to pitiful fool, duped and discarded. My mother's voice cut through the whispers, sharp and cruel. Finally, a grandson to carry the Carter name. "We always told you, Emily, you couldn't even give Michael a son." My father nodded in agreement, his face set in grim satisfaction, as if some cosmic wrong had been righted by Melissa's words. The humiliation clawed up my throat, burning behind my eyes, but I held it in gripping Grace tighter, shielding her from the stares. Someone behind me whispered, "She'll lose the house. It belongs to the boy now." Another muttered, "Widow with a daughter can't handle that kind of property anyway." Melissa basked in the spectacle, her smile widening as she watched me crumble in silence. She cradled her son like a trophy, her eyes glittering with triumph, her voice carrying the final blow. Michael wanted his real child to have security. "It's time we honored his wishes." The room erupted in low murmurs, the air thick with judgment, pity, and barely concealed amusement. I wanted to scream that it was a lie, to rip that fraudulent will into shreds and throw it back in her smug face, but something inside me told me to wait. I remembered every time they had gaslighted me, every time they told me I was too emotional, too dramatic. If I screamed now, they would nod knowingly and say, "See, she can't handle the truth." So I stood there trembling but silent, forcing my lips into the faintest curve of a smile that felt like shards of glass pressed against my skin. I knew what no one else in that room did. I knew about the notarized will locked away in my lawyer's office. I knew about the medical records, the vasectomy, the journals that proved Michael's devotion to me and Grace. I knew the truth, and the truth would not only silence Melissa, it would destroy the house of lies she had just built. My silence was not weakness, it was strategy, though. In that moment, it felt like suffocation. Grace tugged at my sleeve, whispering, "Mommy, why is everyone looking at us?" My throat tightened, but I bent down, kissed her hair, and whispered back, "Because they don't know the truth yet." She nodded, trusting me, her innocence a balm against the poison of the room. Around me, the laughter returned softer now, edged with mockery. My parents beamed at Melissa, congratulating her as if she had won a battle. Cousins avoided my eyes, unable to decide whether to pity or ridicule me, and I stood in the middle of it all, humiliated, burned alive by their contempt, but already planning how to turn their cruelty into their undoing. That night, as the party wound down and I slipped out with Grace in my arms, I caught Melissa's gaze across the room. She smirked again, mouthing the words, "It's mine now." I said nothing. But inside, a fire lit hotter than grief, sharper than humiliation. She thought she had broken me. She thought she had won, but she had no idea what was coming. When I left Melissa's house that night, the cool air hit my face like a slap, cleansing but not soothing. Grace slept in my arms, her cheek pressed against my shoulder, while my mind replayed every smirk, every whisper, every cruel word hurled at me inside that living room. My parents' pride, Melissa's triumphant declaration, the forged will spread across the cake table like a dagger, it all looped endlessly, a nightmare I could not wake from. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened, my heart pounding with a mixture of rage and dread. By the time I laid Grace in her bed, I knew I could not let this stand. Melissa had humiliated me publicly, but humiliation would not be the end of my story. Proof would be. The next morning, I called Mr. Clark, the attorney Michael and I had worked with when we purchased our house and drafted our wills. He was a seasoned man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for leaving no stone unturned. When he picked up, his voice carried the warmth of someone who had known our family for years, but also the steel of a man who had fought legal battles longer than I had been alive. I told him everything: Melissa's announcement, the forged will, the humiliation. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Emily, listen to me carefully. That paper she waved around has no legal weight unless it's notarized and filed. I have Michael's actual will in my office, witnessed and sealed. You are the sole beneficiary aside from the trust set aside for Grace. No one can take that house from you." Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with anger. The truth was on my side, but Melissa had chosen to make this public to smear me in front of everyone. A legal victory alone would not erase that. I needed to dismantle her lies piece by piece until there was nothing left. Mr. Clark suggested we start with the documents. 2 days later, I sat in his office surrounded by manila folders. He slid a copy of Michael's notarized will across the desk, complete with signatures from 2 witnesses and the seal of the state. "This," he said, tapping the embossed stamp, "is the only document that matters. Courts don't recognize photocopies passed around at birthday parties." I traced my fingers over Michael's familiar signature, tears stinging my eyes. He had taken care of me even in death. But the will alone wouldn't crush Melissa's claims. We needed more. That's when Mr. Clark leaned back and said, "Emily, if she's willing to commit fraud like this, she may have left other trails. Hire a private investigator. It'll cost money, but it'll be worth every penny." Enter Mr. Harris, a wiry man in his 50s with sharp eyes that seemed to read people like open books. He carried a small notebook everywhere and spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone who didn't waste time. Within a week, he had uncovered more about Melissa's life than I thought possible. He showed me records of overdue credit card bills, eviction notices from 2 years ago, and even a civil suit where she had been accused of misrepresenting her finances. "She's drowning in debt," Harris said flatly. "This isn't about love or family or Michael. It's about money. She saw your house and decided to make it hers." Still, Melissa's boldest claim wasn't about money. It was about her son's paternity. That's where the third piece of proof came in, the one that made my stomach clench and my heart ache. Michael and I had decided after Grace was born that we were done having children. It wasn't an easy decision, but with finances tight and both of us working long hours, we agreed our little family of 3 was enough. Quietly, privately, Michael had gone through with a vasectomy. It wasn't something we broadcasted to the world, but I had the medical paperwork tucked away in a folder at home, along with follow-up tests confirming its success. When I showed them to Mr. Clark, his eyes widened. "Emily, this is ironclad." Legally and biologically, her claim crumbles. I stared at the papers, the doctor's signature, the dates. They were cold, clinical proof, but they carried the warmth of Michael's voice in my memory. "One is enough," he had told me with a smile, holding Grace in his arms. "I don't need anything more than the 2 of you." That memory gave me strength. The fourth piece of proof came unexpectedly from something as intimate as Michael's journals. He had kept notebooks filled with sketches, engineering ideas, and reflections about his life. In the weeks after his death, I couldn't bring myself to open them, afraid of drowning in his words. But now I forced myself to turn the pages. Over and over he wrote about me and Grace, about his dreams for us, about how proud he was to be a father to a daughter. In one entry, he wrote, "I wish my parents-in-law could see what I see. Grace is a miracle, not a disappointment. Emily gives me everything I ever wanted. Melissa doesn't understand boundaries. I need to protect Emily from that jealousy." Tears blurred my vision, but I photocopied those pages highlighting his words. They were his voice reaching back from the grave to defend me. Harris Everthorough also dug into Melissa's digital footprint. He found text messages between her and a friend where she admitted she was going to make Emily pay and that she had a plan to get the house. He printed screenshots, timestamps intact, her words damning her own intentions. It wasn't just fraud now, it was premeditated malice. Finally, Mr. Clark pulled together the financial documents, the deed to the house mortgage payments made from both Michael's and my joint account life insurance policies naming me as the beneficiary. She has nothing, he said firmly. Every claim she's making is smoke. But Emily, we can't just tell her she's wrong. We need to show her step by step until she has nowhere to hide. That became the strategy, a ladder of proof. Each rung stronger than the last, each one designed to dismantle her lies. The forged will would fall to the notarized one. The claim of paternity would shatter under medical records. Her financial motives would be exposed by Harris's findings. Her character would be revealed in her own words. And above it all, Michael's journals would remind everyone of the truth he had carried in his heart. I gathered the folders, stacked them neatly, and felt a shift inside me. For the first time since the funeral, I felt powerful. Melissa thought she had cornered me with whispers and humiliation, but she had underestimated me. She had forgotten that I had lived my whole life surviving gaslighting, favoritism, and dismissal. Silence had been my weapon before, but now I had an arsenal of evidence, and when the time came, I would use it all. That night, as Grace slept in her room, I sat at the kitchen table with the files spread out before me. The lamp cast a golden glow across the papers, and I imagined Michael sitting across from me, his hand resting over mine. "You're not alone," I whispered, tracing his signature on the will. "We'll fight this together." The house was silent, but I felt his presence in every page, every line of proof that bore his name. I knew the confrontation was coming. Melissa would not back down willingly, and my parents would cling to their grandson as the family's salvation. But the proof was undeniable, and when I presented it, it would not only end Melissa's lies, it would strip away the foundation of favoritism that had poisoned our family for decades. I wasn't just fighting for a house or for Michael's memory. I was fighting for Grace, for her right to grow up knowing she was enough, that being a girl didn't make her lesser, that truth could outlast prejudice. I closed the folders, stacked them neatly, and slid them into my bag. Tomorrow, I would invite Melissa and my parents over. Tomorrow the gaslighting would end. Tomorrow the proof would speak. I invited them to my house on a Saturday afternoon. Melissa arrived first, her baby on her hip, her chin lifted high as if she were already victorious. My parents followed close behind, carrying bags of toys for their grandson, their faces tight with disapproval the moment they crossed my threshold. Grace sat on the couch, clutching her stuffed rabbit, sensing the tension that thickened the air. I had set the stage carefully. The living room was neat, the folders of evidence stacked on the coffee table beside a small voice recorder. I pressed the button, the red light blinking quietly. In our state, one-party consent was enough, and I was more than ready to capture every word. "Why are we here, Emily?" my father asked, his voice sharp. "Haven't you dragged this out long enough? Melissa has a right to what belongs to her son." Melissa smirked, bouncing her baby on her knee. "We don't have to make this ugly. Just sign over half the house and we'll be done with it." I leaned forward, my voice calm but steady. "Before we talk about dividing anything, let's clear a few things up. Melissa, when exactly did this supposed affair with Michael happen?" She blinked, caught off guard by the question. "It's not about when, it's about the fact that it happened," she snapped. "That's strange," I said softly, "because Michael kept a very detailed journal. He wrote almost every night. And not once did he mention you. Not once did he hint at another relationship. In fact, he wrote the opposite." I slid a photocopy of one page across the table, Michael's handwriting underlined. "Emily and Grace are my everything. Melissa doesn't understand boundaries." Melissa's eyes flickered, but she forced a laugh. "Journals can be faked. Maybe you wrote that yourself." My mother nodded quickly, eager to reinforce her. "That doesn't prove anything." "Then, let's talk about the will." I continued unfazed. I pulled out the notarized document, its embossed seal gleaming under the lamp. "This is Michael's real will, signed, witnessed, and filed with the court. The only beneficiary is me, with a trust set aside for Grace. There is no mention of Melissa or her son. What you waved around at the party was a forgery, a crime punishable by prison. Did you know that? Melissa's face drained of color. You're lying. Mr. Clark, who had agreed to join quietly at my request, cleared his throat from the armchair where he sat. She's not lying. I am Michael's attorney of record. That document is legitimate. What you presented was fraud. If this continues, I will not hesitate to involve the district attorney. The room fell silent, tension snapping like a live wire. My father's eyes darted between Melissa and the attorney, uncertainty cracking his certainty. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out the medical records, the cold clinical pages that carried the final blow. Melissa, you claimed your son is Michael's, but Michael had a vasectomy 2 years ago after Grace was born. Here are the doctor's notes and follow-up tests confirming it was successful. Biologically, it is impossible for him to be your child's father. Melissa gasped, her bravado shattering. My mother shook her head, muttering, maybe he reversed it. Maybe he didn't tell you. I met her eyes, my voice steel. Medical records don't lie. This is the truth you refuse to see. Finally, I laid out Harris's findings, the overdue bills, the lawsuits, the text messages where Melissa boasted to her friend about taking my house. I read her words aloud, each syllable hammering into the silence. I'm going to make Emily pay. I'll get that house, just watch. Melissa buried her face in her hands, sobbing now, the weight of her lies crushing her. My father stared at the floor, my mother's lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. The silence was thicker than any shouting could have been. I pressed stop on the recorder, the red light vanishing. You wanted a public humiliation, Melissa. You got one. But this time it's the truth humiliating you. She looked up, her mascara-streaked desperation spilling from her eyes. I just needed help. I'm drowning. I thought if I had the house, if my son was recognized. Don't you dare use your son as an excuse. I snapped, my composure finally cracking. He's innocent. You are not. You used him as a weapon, a pawn in your greed. You dragged Michael's memory through the mud and tried to steal the home he built for us. That isn't help. That's betrayal. The room vibrated with my words. Grace peeked over the couch, her eyes wide, and I softened, holding out my hand for her. She toddled over, clutching my fingers. Mommy, she whispered, are we okay? I bent down, kissed her forehead, and whispered back. We are, because the truth is stronger than lies. Melissa crumpled into her chair, rocking her baby, her shoulders shaking. My parents looked at me for the first time, not with disdain, but with something closer to fear, maybe even shame. They had stood behind Melissa for years, excusing her cruelty, amplifying her favoritism. But now the evidence lay in black and white, undeniable. The foundation of their bias had cracked, and they could not pretend otherwise. I straightened, gathering the documents back into the folder. This ends here. You will not speak of Michael again. You will not spread lies about me or Grace. If you do, I will take this evidence to the police and you will face charges for fraud and forgery. Do you understand? Melissa nodded weakly, her voice a hoarse whisper. Yes. I turned to my parents. And you will stop treating Grace as less because she is a girl. She is my daughter, Michael's daughter, and she is more than enough. If you cannot accept that you will not be part of her life. The words hung heavy, final, like the closing of a door. For once, they did not argue. I knew then that the confrontation was not just about Melissa's lies or the forged will or the house. It was about ending decades of gaslighting, of favoritism, of being made to feel less. And with the truth laid bare, with the proof stacked high like armor, I had finally done it. The silence after this confrontation felt heavier than the accusations that had filled the room before. Melissa sat slumped on my sofa, rocking her baby mechanically, her face pale, her eyes swollen from tears. My parents avoided my gaze, their proud postures bent, their certainty fractured. For the first time, I felt not smaller but taller, not weaker but unshakable. The evidence had stripped away every lie, every ounce of false superiority, and now it was time to decide what came next. I could have pressed charges right then. Mr. Clark had made it clear forgery, fraud, defamation, each one carried weight in a courtroom. Melissa could face fines, maybe even prison. But as I watched her clutch her son, a child far too young to understand the weight of his mother's actions, my heart shifted. The boy was innocent just like Grace. He didn't ask to be born into lies. He didn't ask to be wielded as a weapon. To destroy Melissa completely would be to leave him without stability, and though my anger burned hot, I could not scorch the earth beneath a child's feet. I sat back down, pulling Grace into my lap, her small fingers twining with mine. My voice was calm, steady, deliberate. Here's how this will go. Melissa, I will not press charges as long as you agree to 3 things. First, you will never again make any claim about Michael being your child's father. The medical records speak for themselves. That lie ends today. Second, you will seek counseling, not just for the debt you've racked up, but for the jealousy and resentment that pushed you to this point. And third, you will respect boundaries. My home, my daughter Michael's memory, they are not yours to twist or take. Do you understand? Melissa's lips trembled. She nodded slowly, her eyes dropping to her son's tiny face. I understand. I turned to my parents, my voice sharpening. And you will stop feeding this poison. You will stop pretending that Melissa's son is worth more than Grace because of his gender. You will stop gaslighting me when I call out the truth. For years, you told me I was too sensitive, too dramatic. No more. Grace will grow up knowing she is enough, that being a girl is not a flaw. If you cannot give her that respect, then you will not be part of her life. This is not negotiable. My father swallowed hard, his jaw tightening, but for once he said nothing. My mother's eyes welled with tears, her voice a whisper. We just wanted a grandson to carry the name. Then you should have valued the granddaughter who carries our love, I snapped, my patience breaking. Names fade. What endures is how we treat the people we claim to love. And you have treated Grace like she is invisible. That ends now. The room went still. Melissa sobbed quietly. My parents sat stiff and silent, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't triumph in the way Melissa had gloated at her party. This wasn't about parading victory. It was about reclaiming dignity, about planting boundaries as firm as steel. I looked at Mr. Clark, who nodded in approval, then gathered the folders back into my bag. The evidence would remain ready should I ever need it again. But for now, I had drawn the line, and they had seen the cost of crossing it. When they left Melissa clutching her child, my parents trailing behind with slumped shoulders, the house felt lighter. Grace climbed into my lap, her little arms circling my neck. "Mommy," she whispered, "are we safe now?" I kissed her hair, breathing in the soft scent of shampoo, and answered, "Yes, baby." Because the truth protects us. I knew the wounds wouldn't heal overnight. My parents' favoritism wouldn't vanish with a single conversation. Melissa's envy wouldn't dissolve in a day. But the balance of power had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't the invisible daughter, the dramatic one, the girl who was never enough. I was the woman who stood, who fought, who proved. The resolution wasn't just about keeping my house or defending Michael's memory. It was about building a future for Grace where she would not carry the same scars I had. It was about teaching her that silence can be strength, that boundaries can be love, and that truth is the sharpest weapon we have. And so, I closed the door that night with a finality that echoed through my bones. The war they had waged on my worth was over. I had won not with rage, but with proof. Not with cruelty, but with boundaries. And that victory would outlast their whispers, their bias, their lies. It would endure because it was built on truth. The days after the confrontation moved slowly, but they carried a different weight. The whispers from that birthday party no longer haunted me because I had replaced them with the sound of truth spoken aloud. Melissa kept her distance, her messages short and clipped as though ashamed to face me. My parents tried to call a few times, their voices softer than I had ever heard, but I held the boundaries I had drawn. For the first time in my life, I didn't bend to their excuses. I didn't swallow their gaslighting. I didn't question my worth. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of pink and gold across the sky, I walked into the backyard with Grace. She carried a small packet of flower seeds, clutching them like treasure. "Let's plant them for Daddy," she said, her voice innocent but sure. Together we knelt in the soil, pressing the seeds into the earth, covering them gently. I felt the dirt beneath my fingers, cool and grounding, a reminder that from endings come beginnings. As we watered the ground, Grace looked up at me and asked, "Will they grow strong?" I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Yes, baby, because they have roots now." That was the truth of our lives. For years, my roots had been buried under the weight of favoritism and lies, but now they stretched deep, nourished by proof, by boundaries, by love. Michael's memory lived in every corner of our home, in the laughter of our daughter, in the seeds we planted together. His legacy was not tied to a name or to the gender of a child, but to the strength of the family he built with me. As the first shoots of green broke through the soil weeks later, I felt something inside me bloom as well. Not relief, not triumph, but peace. The storm that had raged through funerals and birthdays, through humiliation and confrontation, had cleared. What remained was clarity. I realized then that this story was never just about Melissa's lies or my parents' bias. It was about survival, about standing firm when the world tries to convince you that you are less, about proving that worth is not measured in sons or signatures, but in truth and resilience. Grace would grow up knowing that. She would know her father loved her beyond measure, that her mother fought for her, and that being a girl was not a curse, but a gift. And to anyone who has ever been silenced, dismissed, or gaslighted by the people who should have loved them most, I say this: the truth is on your side. Sometimes it takes time, sometimes it takes proof, but it will always shine brighter than lies. If family betrayal hits close to home, if you've ever been made to feel small in the place where you should have felt safe, you are not alone. I'd love to know where you are watching from and what time it is there. Share your story in the comments. I promise someone out there needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like mine, stories of betrayal, resilience, and the quiet power of truth, please subscribe. Because every story matters and every truth deserves to be told.